Greetings to the library. I want to thank the members of the Programming and Communications Committee for putting together another fabulous Meet the Author talk. I think we've had about 20 programs scheduled for the fall, so it's been a really robust season. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the NU Bookstore, who is our wonderful stalwart partner, as well as the Department of Political Science. Please help to support these programs by becoming a library supporter, and there's information that will be circulated about that. Our Meet the Author series is really special at Northeastern. Through book discussion and our visiting authors, students, faculty members, and the Northeastern community is enabled to have really wonderful discussions and explore and discover more about important issues of today. And I think that this is a really timely topic, the broad topic of politics. And actually, in Jessamyn's first two book chapters, she talks about elections, which is really timely, as well as the economy, which we all are concerned about. I want to welcome Jessamyn. Jessamyn is no stranger to politics. Her father, Kent Conrad, is a senior Democratic senator from North Dakota, and her uncle is former governor of North Dakota. Jessamyn is a graduate of Harvard and Cambridge and is pursuing her doctorate at Columbia. She is also a fully modern woman. She has a blog, and she also has a Facebook and MySpace profile, so you can become a fan of Jessamyn's on Facebook. And I'm hoping, Jessamyn, that you'll join our I Love NU Libraries Facebook group, too. And all of you do, too, out in the audience. Welcome, Jessamyn. We're looking forward to an engaging discussion.
Great. Okay. Maybe I can put this. Okay. Is that picking me up at all? I can speak loud. I teach, so I'll project. So the way I usually go about this is I talk about three different things, and I'm going to try to keep this pretty short so that we can have more of a discussion at the end, which I think tends to be more interesting. And I think because you guys, I think there are people here from the political science department, you probably have a lot of thoughts of your own about what's going on right now in our political situation. So the three things that I tend to talk about are, first of all, my reasons for writing the book, which people ask me about a lot, the structure of the book, and then the bigger overall abstract project of the book. As our moderator mentioned, I did grow up in a political family, and it's odd because on the one hand, my father is a Democrat, and my uncle, who was governor and is now Secretary of Agriculture under Bush, is a Republican. But it doesn't actually stop there. Among various other family members who have been elected officials in North Dakota, my cousin, who is my uncle's daughter, so the Republican side of the family, she is a major Democratic operative. And she was one of Kerry's top people, and now she's one of Obama's lead advance people. So we really do have a mixed family. And people always ask me what it was like growing up in this family. And I always say, well, I don't know. I mean, I didn't have any other way to grow up. But mostly my family is pretty good about not putting me in the middle. But I grew up learning very odd things, like the backs of cars, convertibles, in the summer when you have to go in the 4th of July parade and wave is very hot. And you always have to bring something to sit on. And this is something that nobody will tell you, but you learn in politics. And I was just recalling that I had to be in a lot of parades when I was little because I was, the cute little kid set up to wave and take pictures of. And one of my earliest memories is being in a parade in North Dakota on the 4th of July, and we were right behind the Turkey Farmers Association. I swear to God this is true. And the Turkey Farmers Association was all these farmers with turkeys on leashes. And it started to rain. And you guys probably don't know that a problem with turkeys that are bred for eating is that they're really stupid. And when it rains, they try to drink the rain, and they drown themselves. So it was the 4th of July parade, and all these farmers start screaming, grabbing the turkeys, and these turkeys are kind of dropping over in front of me. And so for a very long time, I was quite traumatized by turkeys as a child. So this is what my political life was and how it prepared me for turkeys. But because of the background I have, people always assume that I know a lot about politics. And while it's true that there are these kind of funny things that I've learned, it's also true that I didn't necessarily always know about every side of every issue. And especially, I think, the other side of an opinion that I had, I wouldn't necessarily be able to explain to you what the ideas behind it were, what the ideology was, why people thought what they thought. And I also found that when I wanted to learn more about issues, it was really very hard. I found it was very hard to find basic information, and I found it was very hard to find non-tainted, not very partisan information. And that always bothered me, and I always sort of wondered why a book like mine didn't exist, and it really didn't. It was a surprising thing when I was writing the book proposal for it that I really looked around for something that was nonpartisan basic information on political issues, and I could not find a single thing. And one of the things that I think is important about writing this as a book instead of, for example, a website or somebody having a talk radio program where they just talk about issues, was that in a book you have a sort of permanent record of information, something that you can come back to. It sits there, it's accessible, but it's also a lot of information in one place, all bound together. And one of the reasons I tried to bold, if you'll look at the book, you'll see that there are all these terms that are in bold print. Because, as I say, I find it's very hard to find out what necessarily a term means. So one of the things that you'll hear a lot, for example, especially right now, is that the Fed sets interest rates. I mean, you've heard this in the past year, right? Okay. This is a lie. The Fed does not, by any stretch of the imagination, set interest rates. It targets interest rates. And so what it does is says, we think the interest rate should be 5%, and it buys and it sells government securities in order to force the market to create an interest rate around what they want. This is important because if you say that the Fed sets interest rates, what you're implying is a certain kind of power that this agency has over policy. And if you say that it, in fact, can only target it, you are more accurately representing the kind of power that the Fed has and the kind of power that other institutions have. And that's a really important distinction, and it's that kind of distinction that often gets glossed over in sort of basic media sources. So when I wrote this, I wanted to avoid some of these pitfalls. And there were three things that I did to attempt to do that. One is that I always try to give the historical background of any issue. I try to talk about all sides of an issue, and I always talk about interest groups. So historical background, probably those of you who are in politics or political science have heard the phrase that the generals always fight the last war. Well, this is something that's always said in international relations, but it's true really with every issue. Every issue exists against the backdrop of previous issues. So I think the really obvious one here is Iraq. And when we talk about Iraq, when we talk about the Iraq War, people in government are always talking about Vietnam and World War II. These are the frameworks through which they approach the issue. And that's very important to understand if you want to understand why people think what they do and why they're acting the way they're acting. Then there's the issue of there being more than one side of an issue. I always try to be very careful when I look at political problems not to polarize them into left and right or Democrat and Republican, liberal, conservative, because a lot of issues don't break down like that. A lot of times there are 3 or 4 different sides to an issue, not just 2. And a lot of the time, an issue has very little to do with political affiliation. Coal is a really good example of this. Any politician who is from a state that uses or consumes a lot of coal, and what they do is they're using coal, they're burning it to produce electricity. This is what we use most of our coal for in this country, is pro-coal. And they will always vote for a new $5 billion gasification plant, coal gasification plant, because it's in their state's interest. And it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat, they will support this. So the issue of regional interests is very important. And finally, I think we should always ask who stands to gain Who wants what and why? If you ever are trying to understand a political issue, this is, I think, the best way to approach it. Just try to figure out who is going to benefit and how are they going to benefit. And it's not necessarily an issue of corruption or special interests or anything, but government is fundamentally about apportioning resources. That is the job of the government. It is to determine fairness in this apportionment and then to allow access or to distribute appropriately. And politics is fundamentally fighting over those kinds of distribution networks. So we always need to look at the distribution network when we want to understand things. So finally, I want to mention the bigger project of this book, which is really encapsulated in the subtitle, in that it's a nonpartisan guide to political issues. A lot of people have been diagnosing, I think, a lot of problems or difficulties with our contemporary media structure, and this book was, in a very small way, an attempt to kind of try to right some wrongs that I think are occurring in contemporary media. The main issues that I see are three, and they're very interrelated. One is an increasing polarization of American politics, but not of the electorate. In fact, most Americans are quite moderate politically. Two, I think there's a paradox right now of too much information being available to us. And three, I think there's an alienation of independence from the American political system. These problems are mostly new problems, and they're really, I think, very structural. So when I was born in 1978, so 30 years ago, there were 4 or 5 main TV stations. Cable didn't exist. And if you were going to watch TV news, it was on for 1 hour in the evening on 4 networks. So there were 4 hours of TV news available during the day, and there were 4 hours that all the people who worked in TV had to fill, right? That was the amount of information that could come out in a day. How much is there today? How many hours of TV news are there today that need to be filled with programming? I mean, do any of you have cable? I know most of you are in college, but, or have cable at home. How many TV stations do you get? Yeah, a couple hundred, right? And how many of those have news on from 12 to 24 hours a day? Yeah, probably. A couple of C-SPAN channels. There's now, 3 NBC channels, MSNBC, CNBC, there's CNN. Yeah, so there probably is about 10, 12 stations. Okay, so how many? I mean, we could sit down and do the math, but that's not the point. The point is there's a lot of programming that needs to occur every day. So this vast expansion in media space has really encouraged niche marketing. If you are a TV producer and you have to get someone to pay attention to you and not a blog and not, let's say you work for CNN, not MSNBC and not their iPod and not Lost and not Gossip Girl and not all the other stuff that we pay attention to every day, what do? You have to market in a way to the lowest common denominator, because the first thing you have to do is just get somebody's attention. You've got to get them looking at you. And so I think that's this structural difficulty of so much space has led to CNN and MSNBC and these kind of relatively respected news networks running all these kind of crazy stories about runaway brides, because they just have to get you to pay attention. And of course, they have to make money. I mean, they have to get advertisers, and that has to do with how many people are watching. So it's not necessarily that anybody is bad or evil. It's a sort of structural occurrence in the media system. But it also means that the media is not incentivized to ever define a term. There's no incentive for them to sit down and say, okay, look, here's the thing about interest rates. Interest rates don't really function the way most of us tend to think the way they function. The reason that mortgage rates are really high, even though the overall general interest rate is low, is because nobody can actually lend the money, even though the government wants them to, right? Nobody is going to actually explain anything to you. Now here's another problem with the expansion of media space. It turns out people are really most likely to read and listen to things they already agree with. So how many people here, if you're comfortable saying this, how many of you watch The Daily Show regularly? And how many of you would identify as basically on the left-hand side of the political spectrum? Are you mostly the same people who raised your hands? I think so, right? Are there people here who would consider themselves mostly on the right-hand side of the political spectrum? And do you watch Fox News? Raise your hand if you watch Fox News. Yeah, so it's pretty much the same people, right? We tend to listen to information we already agree with. Now, you might also listen to The Daily Show, because you're college students and it's funny. This is a problem. And there's somebody very interesting who's talked a lot about this. His name is Cass Sunstein, who was a scholar at the University of Chicago and has now just come to Harvard. And he talks a lot about the paradox of choice in media structures. In fact, that more choices are not equal to more freedom, and instead they tend to reduce the spectrum of political discussion around two poles. So really, the increasing polarization of American politics, the paradox of too much information, and the alienation of moderates and independents, who kind of fit in the middle and don't like either pole, really stem from one trend, which is this expansion. And Pete Van Huvelen, who wrote for Salon and happens to be a family friend, though I found the quote and liked it and then realized it was somebody I know, said that if new technology gives us unprecedented access to information, it also gives us more ways to avoid information we don't like. So if 30 years ago you watched the news was not polarized because there were only 4 stations, and they had to give some sort of basic news that would cover everything to everyone. But now you can listen to Fox or Air America, or maybe you consider CNN liberal or something. And there was a very interesting experiment that the Sunstein group did around this, which is called the Colorado experiment. And they took a group of people in Boulder, which is a liberal town in Colorado, and then they took a group of people in Colorado Springs, which is a quite conservative town in Colorado, but they're very close to each other. And they got them together to talk about a set of political issues. And first, they had them fill out independently a sheet that sort of talked, that would describe their political views on these 3 issues. They would sort of self-identify where they were on the political spectrum. And then they looked at those surveys, and what they found is that there was a pretty diverse range. The conservatives, sure, they were basically conservative, but some of them had pretty liberal views on, say, gay marriage. Some of them had really conservative views on abortion. It just depended, right? There was a spectrum. Same thing with the liberals. Liberals had a spectrum, basically liberal, but quite diverse set of views. Then they had all the conservatives get together and talk. And they had all the liberals get together and talk, but just to each other. I mean, just liberals to liberals, conservatives to conservatives. Then they filled out those same forms on the same 3 issues. What happened? Liberals got more liberal and less diverse, and conservatives got more conservative and less diverse. Everybody polarized. Everybody kind of narrowed in on a smaller set of viewpoints. What this tells us is that our political affiliations are very largely socially determined. If you live in a conservative area, you are very likely to espouse conservative political views. If you live in New York City, you will almost certainly become a liberal, because it is part of your social identity. It's not just an intellectual phenomenon. And so I think that when you look at something like Fox or Air America, what's important to realize is not only that those things exist because we have partisanship, but that they encourage further partisanship. That these kinds of media sources actually encourage us to be more polarized because they allow us to only listen to information we like and not information from other people. So what I really tried to do with this book is to put a lot of different kinds of information from different views, from different people in one place, so that if you read it, you will have to listen to another group. You will have to consider the point of view of somebody you probably don't agree with. I don't mean to say that I'm against partisanship. I mean, we will always have partisanship. I'm from North Dakota, and there's a lot of jokes about church basement suppers and the women, the Lutheran ladies, fighting over it. And, who brings the dessert? The dessert's always the big fight because dessert's the easiest thing to make. And but it's true, right? I mean, we all know this. Everyone here who sits on a committee for something in college, there's probably been some sort of internecine struggle with, who buys the pizza or something. And so I don't think I don't think we need to talk about getting rid of partisanship. What we have to talk about is learning what other people think, understanding them, approaching people respectfully, and understanding that dissent is a really important part of our political system. All kinds of dissent. We need to be able to appreciate that. And that's why in this book, I talk about things within the frame of political identities, not just policies. That I do try to talk about things in terms of their social definition. And so I think the real problem that's happened right now is because of this kind of polarization, there's a lot of fighting over facts. People say, I want to do X, and the other person says, oh, no, you're lying. What you're really trying to do is A. And somebody quotes a number of the deficit. They say the deficit is this many gazillion dollars, and somebody else says, oh, no, it's not. It's actually only half that. And then how do we, as a political electorate, figure out who to listen to? How do we even have the kind of information that we need to make up our minds about a set of policies? I think that is the real problem with kind of where we are in our media structure. And I really understand why people are at a point where I think they walk into bookstores and they see Ann Coulter and Michael Moore, and those two people just want to scream at somebody and scream at each other. And they throw up their hands and they're like, I'm going to go buy Harry Potter, because nobody's screaming at each other in Harry Potter. And if they do, it's going to be okay because there's magic. And that is great, but our political system depends on an informed electorate. I mean, a democracy assumes as a precedent an informed electorate. And if we are not, we don't have a functioning democracy. Even if we think we do because we have people voting, we really don't. And so, I think that if we believe in any sense in the political system we have, or think it's a good idea, we have a responsibility to think in a realistic way about issues and consider other people's points of view. And so that's really what I tried to do. And that's it. And I think if anybody has questions or things that they're kind of interested in or want to discuss. Yeah?
Do you think partisanship hampers the political process?
I think it depends on the kind of partisanship. I mean, there's a famous statement that conservatives usually trot out, and they say, if there isn't partisanship, it means that somebody has won, and then it's basically totalitarianism. So, on the one hand, no. And dissent and disagreement always is a richer way to arrive at a solution to a problem. If you have to argue something, and you'll find this probably when you write a paper, for example. If you consider somebody arguing for another side of something that you're thinking, you will have a richer argument. What happens, again, the problem is when people argue over facts, one, when there are facts that can exist, and two, when people so disrespect each other that they can't sit down together and try to reach a conclusion together. And I think that this economic crisis, which it absolutely is really a great example, because there are facts that are involved. We owe a certain amount of money to China, period. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars we owe to China. Now, the people who have been in charge of running up that debt are always going to have an interest in trying to minimize the numbers that they quote, and the people who want to get those people out of office always have an interest in running up that number. But if you can't agree on the actual number, how do you pay the bill back? I mean, if you bought a $100 coat on your mom's credit card, and she says, you spent $3,000, and you say, I spent $50, I mean, that's not going to help you pay the $100 back, right? I mean, somehow, somewhere, someone's got to come down and talk about facts. And I mean, since my dad has been in Washington, Washington has become much different. It used to be much more congenial. The past dozen years has really changed things. And frankly, the quality of people on both sides of the spectrum, the quality of the Senate has just dropped a lot. I mean, the kind of ability, I think, and skill and intelligence of people who were in the Senate 30 years ago has changed. And again, I think it's a lot of this polarization. We're much less likely to vote for someone who we kind of disagree with but think is really smart than we used to. So it depends on what kind of partisanship is the answer. Yeah?
We have a microphone.
Oh.
I would say that I think it is probably what you said about if somebody watches only Fox News, or on the other hand, they watch only America or some liberal show, they're probably not going to get all the facts in either case.
Yeah.
I think the great thing, though, is the internet, because I rarely watch Fox News. If you picked out certain selected positions of mine, you might think that I was very liberal. But actually, I'm very conservative, and I take those stands even from a conservative standpoint. For example, I'm against the war in Iraq. I'm pro-environmental, although not fanatical on the issue. And there's certain other things like... You're
a small c conservative.
Well, yeah,
you're a classic
I'm a
conservative.
Right. Rather than a neocon.
Right.
You might say. But anyway, I say in the internet, that's where you get a lot of the information that is often nonpartisan or actually attacking both major parties.
Yeah.
Because essentially, while they fight on certain hot-button issues and over personalities, both major parties more or less stand for some of the same things. Or most of the same things.
Sure.
And when the bipartisanship is something I really don't like, because that means the two major parties have gotten together to shaft me.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, and I think that, you know, this was, I mean, what you're talking about is sort of a little bit the way sort of Nader talked about the parties, right? That they're both sort of corrupt giant organizations. Well, look, to a certain extent, that's true, because they're both parties in power, and people in power have a certain set of interests, always, right? I mean, this is just true. Of course, on the other hand, they're very different. But you bring up an interesting point, that if you're talking about bipartisanship, then you actually, what you really have is a strengthened group in power. And that's why, one of the reasons I say I'm not against partisanship. I mean, you know, one-party states are not places I'd want to live, right? I mean, and I've lived all over the world, and I've lived in places. I mean, I lived for a while in Morocco, and in Morocco, you do not talk about politics, period. Except if you're going to bash Western Sahara, because they had a big war there. But you don't say a word about the king, and if you can get somebody to talk about politics at all, they're very nervous about it, and they literally look over their shoulder. I mean, there hasn't been political violence there of an internal kind in 20, 30 years, but there was a lot at a time. I mean, there were people hauled off by secret police. So what you're saying, I think, is true, and I think one of the things that's interesting about the internet is that, as I think you're getting at, there's a populist movement on the internet that is not, doesn't necessarily have the powerful party interests at heart, but is more interested in opening up the discussion to more people. And that is one of the things I think is fabulous about what's happened on blogs, especially. I mean, does anyone here blog? A couple of you blog. How many of you read blogs, political blogs, pretty frequently? Yeah, I mean, and this is something that's interesting. I ask this question a lot in book events, and when I have more young people, there are always a lot of hands raised. And older people then come up and ask me, they're like, I know about blogs, but I don't know which one to read. I don't know if I can trust them. And blogs, and what I always say is, you know, one of the things that's really neat about, I think, blogs is that they open up the political discussion to people with different kinds of talents. So there's a guy who blogs on a blog that I read a lot that's run by a good friend of mine, who has, you know, is trained, I think, as an economist, but he's just really good with numbers. And so he does these really interesting statistical analyses of various political issues and of poll numbers. And that's really cool. I mean, I get to access this really smart person who I don't happen to know as a friend, who wouldn't be on CNN, you know, because he's like some economics professor somewhere who just happens to be interested in politics. So I do think that the opening of the internet space is incredibly important. And I think it's one of the major reasons that this political cycle is very different than other political cycles. I mean, if Obama wins in a landslide, which he very well might, it will have a lot to do with harnessing the organizational power of the internet, I think.
Jon Stewart spoke here at Northeastern on Friday night.
Oh, that's right.
And then he
Monday, he sort of reiterated some of the comments that he had said on Friday night. I'm just interested to hear your take on this sort of idea that seems to be out there now about there's parts of the country that are pro-America or anti-America, and these comments are out there, and obviously Jon Stewart took issue with it, and just
which was a really funny segment.
yeah, no, it was great on Monday when I saw it.
Yeah.
So I'm just
It's very interesting. As somebody who's, I mean, I'm from North Dakota, and I am from a, if you were gonna like this breakdown that certain Republicans have been drawing, I am from the real America, right? I mean, my town has 125 people, counting outlying ranches, okay? Yeah. Let me put it this way. I went to a neighboring town once. It's a town where you used to be able to get canning jars, and it's 30 miles away. You can't anymore. And I drove through town one day, and there was this sign stuck on a pole in the middle of the road. I was like, what is this? And I go up to the sign, and it says, "Hoedown, moved to town hall due to rain." So that's the part of the country I'm from. But I've lived in, I've gone to these liberal institutions, right? And I've lived in New York. I have several things to say about this. One, I think that the big political divide in this country is not liberal and conservative. It is urban and rural. Or maybe I should better say exurban and rural, because not just suburbs, but exurbs, where people commute, 100 miles to work, right? These places have developed incredibly different cultures. It was not the case that 100 years ago these places had such different cultures. Really, I mean, suburban Bismarck, North Dakota, and the sort of middle-class suburbs of Chicago 100 years ago weren't that different. But they're really different now, right? And one of the things that's happened, I think, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm interested to see if anybody has written about it, is that the meritocracy in this country has become more real. There are fewer barriers to people entering meritocratic institutions. Like Harvard, where I went, I had a very good friend who was on the admissions committee. They scour the country for kids from the middle of nowhere, and they try to get them to come to Harvard. If you grow up now in the middle of nowhere, you can come to Northeastern. And that was much harder 50 or 100 years ago than it is now. I think what this means is that people now who are stuck in these crappy jobs and crappy places that have no jobs feel they feel less trapped in a way, but they feel more trapped if they don't succeed, right? Because I think in their mind, it's no longer, well, I have talents and abilities and I could have made it, but I didn't have the opportunities because those things were closed to me. I wouldn't have gotten into college. I wouldn't have been allowed into college, right? Now, things are relatively open, and you can if you really want to and if you really are able to. And I think that this has contributed to a very, very, very strong insecurity in people in rural and exurban areas about the urban areas. And, my fiance, we were driving through New Hampshire the other day, and we saw a lot of McCain signs, and they say country first. And he went, "Oh, that's what that means." And I went, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Country first. Country, not city." And I went, "What do you mean?" And he said, "That's why they chose country first, not America first, not nation first. It is a subconscious activation of that neural network that says rural. It is you people who live outside of a city, who aren't comfortable with gay people hanging around all near you, who aren't comfortable with people of different colors or different look kind of different because you don't have them around you." And I do think that that's a lot of what's happening. I mean, does anyone know who the Buckleys are? The really important conservatives. And well, like the younger Buckley just left the Republican Party and said, "I don't know what the conservative movement is anymore." I think this is what's happened. And I think this is why this cycle you're going to see a major political realignment. Major. Because the Conservative Party took in this group, this kind of rural, less educated, group of people, and it worked for a long time. But now there's such a divide, and I think that is where the political divide is going to come, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to the kind of small c class of conservatives, where they go, who they vote for in this election cycle, and where the rural, where do these rural voters go? Are they going to continue to vote really strongly Republican or not? Interesting election. Yeah? Yeah. Mm. You have the most awesome senator ever, by the way. Pat Leahy. Pat Leahy, just as a person, if you don't agree with him politically, I was just with him and his family in the Democratic convention, and they're a hoot. He and his son were pinching each other a lot in the van, creating a ruckus.
I was just kind of wondering, what, and it's never really addressed. I feel like when we're talking about the real America, the Jeffrey Johnson on Vermont, even though it fits into that stereotype of being rural.
Right.
Definitely, there's a lot of poverty there as well. And so, I mean, how do you, what do you think would create that situation where it wouldn't end up being conservative, as opposed to New Hampshire or other states like that?
Well, a lot of it has to do with, I think, things that are very hard to really grasp onto as explanations, because it's fundamentally cultural. Vermont has a very interesting history. I mean, it was the center of the Transcendentalist movement, which was extremely kind of touchy-feely liberal, major center of the abolition movement, which of course was originally Republican, but became, very much a liberal phenomenon. So you have these places like my state, North Dakota, where we vote for Republicans for president more reliably than any other state, but our entire congressional delegation is Democrat. And one of them is considered one of the most progressive Democrats in the Senate. So I think that one of the things that you're identifying is the lack of descriptive ability of Democrat and Republican. The political spectrum is vast, and to try to chop it in two is always going to oversimplify it. Again, like in my state, I mean, you can say that it's very Republican, but on the other hand, it's really very kind of socially liberal. I mean, more refugees from other places per capita get settled in North Dakota than any other place, because the Lutheran ministries brings them in. So we have all these Bosnians in North Dakota, and it's not an issue. I mean, and you might consider that a kind of, pro-immigration, almost liberal stance. This issue of the real America, I mean, I think it really does get back to a kind of, there's an insecurity in the rural areas, I think, about what goes on in the big cities. The fact that all media comes out of New York and LA, everything, right? And therefore, you have people who need to create an alternative identity psychologically. And so that alternative identity has centered around a certain kind of patriotism, a lot of Jesus in a lot of places, and in some places, certain issues like abortion. So I think that, Vermont's going to be liberal for a long time. But again, I think that when you talk about these other areas, like North Dakota, which might vote for Obama, by the way, in this election, I mean, he's close there. I think the thing that is most likely to change it is the economy, because people fundamentally vote with their wallets. When the economy is crap, whoever party seems to be in power is going to get voted out. And that's when these big realignments occur. I also think Iraq is a big deal. I mean, I think the fact that so many people agreed with Iraq in the beginning and so many people now don't, that so many people have consciously changed their minds on the subject, allows people a kind of, again, psychological access to changing a political affiliation or political identification. So I think in this cycle, those two things are huge. And honestly, I really believe that in 15 years, our political map is going to look really different than it does now. Yeah.
I just want to comment that you talked about us being more of a meritocracy you spoke for us being more of a meritocracy than we have been in the past. And I think on certain issues like race and gender, that's definitely true, and maybe even in terms of certain regional issues and class issues. However, I think in some ways we are less of a meritocracy than we've been in the past, because it's like many people have advanced degrees, many people very intelligent, capable, and can't make it in America now. Or people may have, even not, if not formal degrees, they may have some skills, may be very hard-working people.
Yeah.
According to the promises that America makes and the media make,
Right.
they should be successful.
Right.
Because they've earned it, or because they
Or because they're working 2 jobs.
However, because of certain things in the political and economic system, and also because they don't fit into a politically correct category. Let's say if a man is, let's say he played football in college or high school, he looks like he might have, or a woman, you know, was a cheerleader, could have been a cheerleader, or a model or something like that, those people rise to the top whether they're smart or not, usually. But people who are not classically attractive according to what society thinks attractive, even if they're smart, often can't make it.
Yeah, I think.
And there's a lot of anger because of that.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I think you're right because again, of mass media. I mean, and plastic surgery. But I mean, you're right that there's a kind of non-functioning meritocratic system in America, which is true. I mean, it did used to be that if you worked 3 jobs, you were gonna do fine because jobs paid enough, and now that's not true. But perhaps what I should say is perception, because it is perceptions that matter, not really the truth, right? I mean, John McCain could be a fire-breathing devil, and Obama could be his like closest minion. If people believe them to be something else, that is how they will vote. So, again, it's a perception. I mean, there is. You know, it's like when I go back to North Dakota and you say you live in New York City and people just go, oh. Because they have a set of perceptions that, you know, as a woman, because they've seen Sex and the City now, you're running around and buying a lot of Prada and screwing everything that moves and drinking a lot. And my life was a lot more boring than that. I was in the library most of the time. But, you know, again, it's the perceptions. And I do think, again, that the media structure has a lot to do with perceptions because they create, I mean, not consciously, but they create archetypes, right? I mean, seriously, New York to a lot of this country is Seinfeld and Sex and the City. I mean, I have these cousins from Texas I kept trying to get to come visit me in New York, never been to New York, and they just wouldn't come. You know, I don't know what they thought would happen, but they just were too freaked out to come. And that is a lot of the country. And I think on the East Coast and on the West Coast, it's very hard for us to access the way people are in the interior. And, you know, they're not dumb and, I mean, they're not hicks, they're just different. They have a different culture. And in some ways, it's a much nicer culture, you know. It is one where people come and they pull you out when you get your car stuck in the mud and are really nice about it. Yeah.
Earlier you spoke of how there's a lot of uninformed voters, especially in this election. I feel like I see that on both sides of the spectrum, especially from the interior. You know, I see a lot of uninformed people voting Republican just because that's what you do. But it's, on the same token, there's a lot of people on both sides that are uninformed. Do you feel like in this election that that's going to swing the election in one favor?
Well, I think in this election, if it does, it'll be Democrat because I think it's going to go Democrat. So, I mean, it's kind of a default answer, I guess, because I think if anything's going to swing the election in favor, it's going to swing it in the Democrats' favor, right? So I'm going to answer Democrats.
My question is, do you feel like if that block of voters, and I'm basically speaking about young voters.
Yeah, but young voters aren't necessarily uninformed voters. I think a lot of the time they're more informed, honestly, because especially in this generation, people have gotten very politically involved and very politically aware in the way that, you know, kids when I was 20 just weren't. Because the economy was insane. I mean, it was, you know, I knew kids who came out of law school and they would get, law firms would fight for them and bid up their starting salary because it was so hard to get a lawyer to stay a lawyer and not go out to Silicon Valley and start at, you know, AOL or something. This is a very different world right now that we live in than it was when I was in high school and in college. And so I think that the economy has really, and Iraq has really engaged people in a way, and I think that young voters are actually many times really more informed. But I think that there's a subtext to what you ask, which is that whether or not, how important it is that we're informed or how we are informed. Now, I do think it's important that we're informed on the issues, but I also think that the way that we subconsciously identify with people isn't necessarily wrong. I mean, I think that you can tell an enormous amount about somebody's personality by listening to them and watching them. From being around politics my whole life, I'm absolutely convinced that you could run most commercials and debates and the elections would turn out with no sound, and the elections would turn out exactly the same way. Because most of the way people vote is how somebody appears to them. And this is why I thought, in this election, I was absolutely going to vote Democrat. And I thought, in the presidential election. And I thought, and I supported Obama from the beginning because I said, you put Obama on the stage next to McCain and there's no way McCain can win. Because Obama is just comfortable and he looks good. And McCain doesn't, and that's the way most people, fundamentally, the way most people vote. And the question is, how inaccurate or accurate is that? You know, it turns out it's very hard to lie with your body. It's very easy to lie with your words. It's very hard to lie with your body. If you give people in studies, and neurologists have done this, psychologists have done this, you give people a set of, have people lie or pretend they're somebody that they're not, give them a script and have other people watch it, people can pick it out. But the best way people can pick it out is not the voice, it's body language. So I think it's really important for us to be informed on issues because the issues really matter, especially right now. But in terms of candidates and how we vote, I also think that these nonverbal, subconscious ways that we communicate with each other are also important. And so you can make an argument that even though you might not know everything about a person, what you see from them can be a very accurate assessment of their character, I think. Yeah?
I think we have time for one more question, and then we want to make sure we save time for a book signing and to buy Jessamyn's book. So immediately after we close, Jessamyn's going to go out to the desk outside, and please fill out comment cards, which are going to be passed out momentarily. That helps us with programming for the future. Thank you very much. One more question.
Yep.
There are a few fringy publications, for example, on which you can genuinely say are biased towards the left, like The Nation. And then there's a few that are genuinely biased towards the right, like the National Review.
Sure.
But in general, I feel like there is this obsessive demonization of the media by both parties. That
sure.
Publicists say all the media is biased towards the left, and the left are saying all the media is biased towards the right. Some people say CNN is too liberal, which I frankly think is pretty absurd. And I'm just wondering if you agree with this, and if you do, why do you think both parties do it, and like what are they hoping to gain from it?
Okay, parties demonize the media when the media is doing things that they think hurt them politically, right? So Palin, because she's said really dumb things in interviews, is now blaming the media for it, right? It's all like, this is the rhetoric. It's, oh, well, it's just, what's the word? It's not sideshow journalism, gotcha journalism, right? That's the whole point. And, look, if the media were treating Obama worse, their campaign would be all over him too. It's interests. I think the problem with the media is not so much that they are liberal or Republican. It's that journalists around Washington, journalists in America, their worth rests on one thing, their access. Who do they have access to? Who is their source? Who talks to them and who doesn't? And this means that reporters in America are motivated to be in with powerful people. And that's what they want. And psychologically, that's what they want. And you just see it. I mean, it's a kind of magnetic pull. And what I think that means is that the media is always biased towards powerful groups. So, for example, during the run-up to the Iraq War, I don't know if any of you remember Judith Miller, who wrote these completely, basically made-up pieces in The New Yorker. I mean, basically, she just made stuff up about how there were all these weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they were going to go bomb everyone, and they were going to kill everyone, and they were going to kill us, and it was in the ground somewhere, but we knew where it was, right? We knew where all the bad stuff was. And this is the New York Times. And the New York Times is considered liberal by most people. Now, I don't think that those were liberal points of view, but they also were inaccurate. So, but why? Why did that happen? I mean, I think it happened because Judith Miller wanted to be the Pulitzer Prize winning Judith Miller, and she had an interest in getting these sources, and she wasn't smart enough to figure out that her sources were just making stuff up and giving it to her. And she didn't check it, and then the editors didn't check it. But of course, they had no way to check it, because how do you check, information from some Turkmenistani guy who comes in and has lunch with you and says, oh yeah, no, I know. I was involved with this program, and it's, 60 miles west of Baghdad. So again, I mean, I think a lot of this has to do with kind of social networks and people's desires and needs, and it's not that, again, it's not that people are evil or bad, it's that people are kind of weak, and that they have interests. And that's why I think you should always look at the interests, including of the media. Who is this reporter? What do they want? What are they trying to get? What is David Broder's interest? What is the New York Times interest? And that is always, I think, the first way we should approach these questions. So media is always biased, but in which direction depends. Depends on the kind of flavor of the political moment, I think.
Thank you so much, Jessamyn.
Yeah.